right, good evening. Can you hear me? Yes? Hi, good. Okay. Well, welcome to the final lecture in the Diverse Roots at the Common Table lecture series. It's a series focused on culinary conversations in the American South. My name is Erica Abrams-Locklear, and I'm a professor, in the English department here at UNC Asheville. I've got a few things to share with you before I introduce tonight's speaker. First, please silence your cell phones. So I'll give you a minute to check. I can never remember if I've done it or not. See? Tonight's lecture will last about 45 minutes, followed by approximately 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. We have a microphone mounted on a stand right there in the middle aisle. So please come up to the microphone to ask your question. We're video recording the event, and we get much better sound if the mic is stationary. Since we have limited time for discussion, please refrain from making comments or observations, but we really want to hear as many questions as possible. Once we conclude discussion, please remain in your seats until Dr. Williams-Forson has had time to get situated at the malaprops table. If you would like to purchase one or all of her books, you may do so after the talk. Many people have worked hard to make this event a success, and I'd like to thank them now. A big thank you to our event partner, Malaprops Bookstore and Cafe, Asheville's own local independent bookstore. They have advertised this event widely and are here tonight selling books. Thank you, Justin Souther, Stephanie Jones-Byrne, Kanda, and the rest of the Malaprops crew. Heartfelt thanks go to Kay West, who interviewed Dr. Williams-Forson and wrote a beautiful article in Mountain Express. Big thanks to Asheville Citizen-Times food reporter Tiana Cannell, who included tonight's event in her food column. Equal thanks go to Gina Malone, editor at the Laurel of Asheville magazine, to Neil Tracy at Edible Asheville, Catherine Frank at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and especially Krissa Requate-Sinkovic in our marketing and communications department here at UNC Asheville. If you learned about this event on Facebook, or heard a radio ad, or saw it in AVL today, you can thank Krissa. Funding for this event is made possible thanks to the Thomas Howerton Distinguished Professor of the Humanities Professorship. And finally, my biggest thanks go to Dr. Williams-Forson, who said yes when I invited her to be part of this series. If you're here, then you already know something about Psyche Williams-Forson's impressive record. She is professor and chair of the Department of American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is author of Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America, winner of the James Beard Media Award for Food Issues and Advocacy in 2023. She is co-editor of Taking Food Public, Redefining Food in a Changing World, and author of Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, Black Women, Food, and Power. She is known nationally and internationally for her work in building the scholarly subfield of Black food studies, and she has published numerous articles on topics such as Black women, food and power, food and literature, food and sustainability, race, food and design thinking, eating and workplace cultures, as well as the historical legacies of race and gender misrepresentation with and without food. She has been interviewed on numerous podcasts and several news articles, and for documentaries including Al Roker's Family Style, NBC Today, Netflix's Ugly Delicious, and The Invisible Vegan. We are extremely fortunate to have her here with us tonight. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson to UNC Asheville.
Okay, you can hear me all right? Yes? Great, good evening, and thank you all so much for coming out for this, what I hope will be an engaging conversation, and also special thanks to Professor Locklear and the numerous people who she's mentioned who I will not attempt to repeat because I won't remember, even though I just heard it a moment ago. But thank you all for coming out. So when we go to meet the trains, Black Women, Food, and Power in the American South. So in 1860, while she was working, and I'm hearing a little bit of, it's down some. Can you still hear me okay? Okay, so while this woman was working at the Richmond train station, she was captured in a sketch by an English physician and educator, Sir Henry Wentworth Ackland, who was visiting America and stopped off at the train station. And he wrote this inscription on this very popular image, which you may have seen in many places. He said, "Negro girls in the most tawdry dress and of extreme vulgarity offer at the station rolls and chicken legs." And that's all we have on her. Aside from this relatively nondescript description, we don't know anything about this woman. We don't know anything about who she was other than she's walking with her head erect, a platter before her, weighted down with rolls and chicken and perhaps other foods. Details about her name, her status, we don't know if she was free or enslaved. We don't know if she was rural or urban. And her overall well-being are non-existent. The story of Julia Brown is only slightly different. A colleague and friend of mine through the Southern Foodways Alliance, John T. Edge, sent me this many, many years ago because of the topic. But this is Julia Brown, and she was part of a calendar that he came across. And this one talks about how she and her daughter would roam the countryside by train, and she would be with her daughter as if she was working with her daughter. And she was able to sell fruit pie lunches to business travelers in and around Corinth, Mississippi. We don't have any dates other than as early as only 2 years after fully gaining the standing of freedwoman, and that was in 1867. And there's literally nothing on this woman or the artist or anything about Corinth, Mississippi, including the historian who's listed here. So we don't know much about this woman either. These women we know a little bit more about, and I purposefully kept the description because earlier today I had the good fortune, and thanks again to Professor Sarah Judson, who's the professor and chair of the history department here, I had the good fortune to speak to her class, and we were talking about sources. And so I purposefully left all of this description because it's really important for us to know how we access archives to find out more about these women. This one says, this is the old apple and cake woman. Here's another image of a set of folks hawking and huckstering perhaps with chicken and other goods. I included this one because I think it's also important that even as we're talking about women, you had children, boys, and mostly boys is what I've seen, and some girls who also worked in this capacity. And then we have this image here of this Gullah woman who also was, according to Yale University and their archive, who was a vendor of some sort. Okay, we don't know. This may have been for her personal wares, but it could also very much have been because she was in an entrepreneurial venture. So these women, whose names we do not know, are among the countless men and women of African and Caribbean descent about whom, again, we know very little or nothing. Until recently, African American women and men who have spent their lives in the capacity of food service have been largely relegated to anonymity, actually, and they're only existent in the pages of popular culture. Specifically, what we've learned about African American women, working class women, tends to center around their basic recognized household labor. that of a washerwoman, a laundress, a tobacco or other industry worker. But what we don't know a lot about are their entrepreneurial ventures. Yet, there is some information about women who have not been completely lost to the historical record. Now, I want to stop here and suggest that lots of communities have had peddlers or hawkers or hucksters, right? So this is not only within African American communities. And so it's important to acknowledge that all races have sold foods and artifacts of varying kinds at markets. This point was reinforced in 2010 when I was invited by the Center for Research in Arts, Social Sciences, and the Humanities at the University of Cambridge to participate in this symposium called Food Hawkers, Selling in the Street from Antiquity to the Present. And they say in their description that street vendors can be found anywhere in the world, right? We know this, in urban and rural locations, and are part of almost any distribution chain, although often at the lower end of the spectrum. They link rural and urban communities through movement of traders and commodities, and they serve a highly varied clientele and play an important role in the marketing of consumer goods to the poorest customers. So it's good to put this conversation in that context. Some of the things that they suggested for our presentations are these that are highlighted in yellow: the identity of food sellers, the role of the street seller in the distribution of food, how it's marketed, food traders in the establishment, the representation of food hawkers, and street traders and economic development. All of these are important areas and questions, but owing to the fact that this informal work, often performed by women, and the fact that we know little about them, none of the answers to these questions often can be found. It's just lost in the historical record. But even as we recognize all races of people sold food and artifacts of varying kinds, what makes this important, this discussion, operate on a different register is the context of enslavement, Jim Crow, and other oppressive systems, along with the political and social constraints that these laws ushered in. And so that forces a different reading of African American business activities. So, let me see here. All right. So using a variety of sources and documents, we can recover some aspects of the activities of these African American women and men who asserted themselves on the landscape within city markets and so forth. The archive of these experiences, culled together from a variety of sources, from oral histories, from snippets of conversations, news articles, local history, folklore, and to some extent, urban legend or myth, as my colleague, Dr. Cynthia Greenlee, talks about, is important to filling in the gaps on this story. So the remainder of this conversation is going to touch on some of what we know about very Black women and men who worked informally and in the underground economy. Here I have this map of the transatlantic slave route and routes so that you can see how much movement took place during the Middle Passage and beyond. The accounts that surround the forced migrations of Africans to Brazil and the West Indies and America rightly recognize that the Atlantic slave trade left an indelible print. So the historical context within which relationships developed between African Americans and food reveals practices that were circumscribed by race, gender, class, and power. Certain boundaries, for example, guided the exchange of goods that took place in and around the marketplace. So I've included this image of the marketplace in Montgomery, Alabama, because as I was telling Dr. Locklear, I gave a talk in Germany several years ago, and after I finished my talk, one of the students said, you know, we have no idea what the marketplace looked like in America, right? And we have to remember that when we're doing these kinds of conversations, not everyone knows what we as scholars may have come across. So here you can see that there is just a lot going on, certainly in the background. You would have had women like this who were actively engaged in the marketing process. In the beginning of building houses out of chicken legs, I used a scene from a novel to talk about how a woman, a Black woman, was negotiating with a white man about cutting in half a raw chicken because he only wanted half of it. And she was like, hey, I can't do that, right? And so the market became a place that was relatively an equalizer, even though those boundaries still existed. And you'll have to also remember, in addition to foodstuffs being exchanged, lots of other activities are taking place, including the selling of human beings. So let's be clear, Black people were no freer than their circumstances allowed at that time. But there is a level of market autonomy and relative independence that was allowed some African Americans to escape simply being victims of their circumstances because some were in positions where they could be enterprising. Here you have an engagement between a Louisiana Indian woman and another person just outside the market. The stout colored woman with the cackling hens. You're going to see chicken featured quite a bit because, of course, that's my first book was referencing the role of chicken in the lives of African American people. So I want to stop here for a moment because I want to draw attention to this image of a peddler. Richardson Wright, in his book Hawkers and Walkers in Early America, talks about the role of the peddler. And he says hawkers and street peddlers have been active in American society almost since the beginning. Most accounts refer to young white men who peddled everything from clocks and beaver pelts to food. African Americans, like other itinerant travelers, used this as an opportunity for economic advancement, even though it was limited. But here you see the peddler has a lot of tin, so they were often called tin men. And in an article on Appalachian isolation, Gene Wilhelm indicates that mountain salesmen were two types of peddlers, trunk peddler and the wagon peddler. This would be an example of the wagon peddler. The trunk peddler would have the job of carrying a canvas pack on a light tin trunk snapped on his back. The wagon peddler was dubbed the tin peddler because he could carry so many old things, usually on a rickety old wagon. And this is all coming from Wilhelm. And he says, shining in tin tea kettles, dippers, pails, cups, pans, and plates rattled the approach of a wagon a mile down the road. So you could hear them coming from a mile away. The heyday for the peddler in Appalachia was 1870 to 1930. And one of the things he points out is this issue of self-sufficiency. And I'm quoting, he says, at a time when most mountain folk had but slight contact with the world beyond the mountains, he was a welcome spring and fall visitor and an important local newscaster. The peddler also cut down on the need to travel and therefore would bring these items to the front door. So the peddler, the hawker, the street vendor were very important, not only for carrying of goods and objects and artifacts, but also for the carrying of information. So we can apply that same concept to these women who were hawkers and vendors. As I mentioned to you a moment ago, this behavior and activity and movement on the part of women was very, very circumscribed. And even though their efforts were meager by any comparison, some enslaved people, let me just go back from this, some enslaved people were able to acquire possessions that would make their lives dramatically or markedly improve. So even though this wasn't widespread and vast, it's enough that we recognize that it took place. I talk about chicken and fowl. Not everyone, of course, sold that. But what's interesting is the way in which that movement is circumscribed. So here you'll find it in the General Assembly of Virginia in 1642, where the law made it unlawful to secretly and covertly trade and truck with other men's servants and apprentices, which tended to the great injury of masters of families, their servants being directly induced and invited to purloin and embezzle the goods of their said masters. Similarly, in Maryland and other locales, established merchants agitated against these itinerant hucksters, intermediaries, and peddlers who would set up their goods and forestall prior to the opening of markets. So these women, in many cases, Black women, would go to the market, but they would stop before they got there and sell their goods along the way. So, you know, there's lots of documentation that I have in building houses where it said they would charge whatever they wanted and it would be purchased because, you know, they only had a little bit. And so a low demand means, or a low, you have a few goods, but you have a high demand, you can charge a higher price. So literally these women, enslaved and some free, but mostly these are talking about enslaved women, were able to participate in the market economy. The South Carolina Gazette, one writer complained that almost on a daily basis, Black women could be found huckstering and forestalling poultry, fruit, eggs, and other goods in and near the lower market from morning till night, buying and selling what and how they pleased to obtain money for both their masters and themselves. Oftentimes, their prices were exorbitant, and they would use all kinds of marketing strategies to choose which white people to sell to and for how much. And lastly, in Louisiana, amongst the Creole African and Native American women vendors in New Orleans could be heard crying, and here's where you're going to participate. Who speaks French? There's got to be someone who speaks French. Jump right out there. Let me see your hand. Okay, perfect. Shout this out for us.
I'm going to butcher it.
That's okay. Go for it. I'll make it worse, so go for it. Calais, right there. Kala. You see that part?
It's Kala, Bel Kala, Torchon.
Okay. One more time, as if you were at a baseball game. Do it for us.
Kala, Bel Kala, Torchon, I think.
Okay. Someone else want to add to that? Well, it sounded good enough for me. So this would be what you would hear as these women are walking through the street as they sold hot pralines, cakes, and donut-like rice fritters called calas on the streets of the French Quarter from the 18th century to well after World War II. And according to the Picayune Guide to New Orleans, the French marketplace was a sight to behold in the early morning hours and most especially on Sundays. Amidst the mixing of people of all races, genders, and ages was the sweet aroma of brioche and calas, right? Café noir and alates. Olays, of course. What is wrong with me? It's late in the day. Olay. I've had all of that. I know how to pronounce some of this stuff. Okay, so here are your pralines, right? And they are super sweet, right? One of my best friends is from New Orleans, and she made some for over the holiday, over the winter holiday. They're really sweet. But you know, this would be part of what you would see. One writer said the old Creole negresses are there with quaint bandana and chignon, offering for sale pralines and P-A-I-N patettes, P-A-I-N, pen bread, so bread, and calas, the latter of species of soft dough made of rice and flour. Calas may be the precursor to beignets or fritters, right? And so this is really what you should have been reading. You should not reading that tiny print, but these are women who are, you see her, you can see her there like she's actually shouting this out, and she has her pralines, and there are your fritters, right? That's your lovely collars. And there's a great video on YouTube of a mother and daughter working on these, and the processes are very extensive. So it does beg the question, how far did these women have to walk? Where did they create this? Where did they get their ingredients, right? Because sugar would have been expensive during that time. So, and how much are they selling? There's so many fabulous questions you wish that you could ask about this, but we don't have that data. Then, of course, there's the modern day pepper pot soup, and these are the ingredients. You've got sweet potato, beef or tripe, garlic, tomato, carrot, and so forth. And this would have been very much seen at the Philadelphia market, the pepper pot lady. And these scenes can be found in Philadelphia at least as late as the early 19th century and 20th century. This oil painting, Pepper Pot, a scene in Philadelphia by John Lewis Krimmel, depicts black women ladling out bowls of spicy soup or stew to white customers of various ages and social classes. So on any given day, you might hear a Philadelphia street cry, from a black woman as she sold her soup, saying, all hot, pepper pot, makes back strong, makes lives long, all hot, pepper pot. And again, made with tripe or other cuts of meat, the cheaper cuts of meat. Bird peppers, root vegetables, yams or plantain, okra, salt, and other seasoning. This African derivative, which is now attributable to the West Indies, is a hearty, spicy soup. Locally, right, and I was sharing this with Professor Locklear, and I were talking about a colleague and friend of mine, Robin Caldwell, who has written on either you can call it the Afro-Lation or the Afro-Latin, right, as Frank X. Walker has termed it. And she says, it is possible to be both Southern and Appalachian. And she talks about the ways in which those women were involved in social movements like the Civil Rights Movement, migrations, and so forth by selling and creating confections, fried rabbit maybe. She references Melinda Russell, who has one of the earliest cookbooks, who was born in Tennessee and trained in Virginia, who talks about fried pies, fresh berries, mashed squash, sweet potato, pumpkin pies, and so forth. And I believe Crystal Wilkinson talked about this when she was here, about her family history of picking blackberries and having to be careful because, not only might you be assaulted by the pricklies on the blackberry vine, but rattlesnakes and so forth were in and around the vines. What I don't know and have not been able to find are direct indications of women in and around the mountains in Appalachia serving as hawkers and vendors. But as I shared with the class earlier today, sometimes you have to read the silence. If you read enough data, you can begin to surmise that perhaps they were using foods and so forth from their own gardens to sell these wares, but also remembering the time period. We're not talking about roads like we have today, right? These would have been very treacherous terrains that they would have been traveling. But some of those foods that might have been used, cornbread, bread pudding, chicken and dumplings, pan-fried chicken and butter, deer jerky, country ham. So these women, hominy is another one. But it does lead you to ask, to whom were they selling or bartering or giving? All right. So now I'm at the point of this conversation where I'm about to start wrapping things up. But I want to focus for a moment on the women who had the most profound impact on this work for me. And these are the women of Gordonsville. Why? Because in Gordonsville, when I was doing my doctoral thesis, I was studying Black folks and the stereotypes with chicken. And I came across an image, which I'll show you in a moment, that showed me these Black women selling chicken. And I said, oh, that's not a reenactment. That's an actual historical picture. I want to know more. So I called the Orange County Tourism. They told me about a fried chicken festival in the honor of these women. I went down, went into what was considered the Historical Society, which was probably a room about as long and as wide as this screen. And I started looking around, you know, books and so forth, and I came across an article, a news article, an interview this woman had given to the Orange County Review for their sesquicentennial. And she said, I'm a third generation waiter carrier. My mother was a waiter carrier and her mother before her. And we sold chicken at the trains. And she said, my mother built our house out of chicken legs. The first one burned down and then she rebuilt it. And I was like, that's the story right there. The ways that black women built houses out of chicken legs. So this is Bella Winston. And after giving a talk in UVA at my alma mater, this man the next day sent me these two images. He said, I have these. I don't know how I came upon them. But he said they may be associated with the waiter carriers, right? Now, someone said to me one time, 2 cents discount for cash. What else would you have used? So what else would you have used? Barter. But if you're using cash, then we will give you a 2 cent discount. And Miss Winston said she grew up not even knowing any part of the chicken existed but the neck, right? They didn't know. Because what happened to the rest of the chicken? It got sold for 25 cents for a breast, 10 cents for a wing and a leg. Every part of the chicken got sold for the enterprise of building houses, of putting oneself into a different social class, so forth and so on. In Scribner's Monthly, so pervasive was this activity and this enterprise that Scribner's Monthly captured it in their 1872 edition. And here again, you see there are not just women, but there are also children, and there are men. I've often wondered, because I've done a deep dive in the census, and there are way more women than the ones who you're about to see in a moment, who are part of this enterprise, who called themselves chicken vendors in the census, but these women called themselves waiter carriers. And one of the things that's interesting is the men worked on the railroad. So I often wondered, did they delay what they were doing on the trains so that their wives, sisters, mothers, family members could have more time, you know, to peddle their wares? And there was a lot of controversy with this, right? Because they would often be in direct competition with tavern owners. But here's what they said, Jedediah Hotchkiss and his team said. Before this, he talks about the Negroes of Gordonsville being very lazy. But then in the very next sentence, he says, the next station was reached in Gordonsville and the junction of Orange and Alexandria, Chesapeake, and Ohio railroads. It's an important point, though a small town in itself. Upon the arrival of our special train, we were surrounded with a swarm of old and young Negroes of both sexes, there we go, carrying large servers upon their heads containing pies, cakes, chicken, boiled eggs, strawberries with cream, ripe cherries, oranges, tea and coffee, biscuits, sandwiches, fried ham and eggs, and other edibles, which we were offered for sale, though scarcely any of our party purchased aught but the berries and cherries, which were gobbled up quick, and the darkies were sent for more. I mean, just the sheer volume of food that these women had on these platters, right? Like, where were they, how far did they have to travel to carry hot tea and coffee? When did they make the sandwiches? The night before? And if they had biscuits, where were they getting the flour? So many questions that, again, are lost to the historical record. So here are the waiter carriers in another image, and you can see how they are set up. They have a stand here that you can see. They come in their business attire, and they're selling these foods. And this is the image that captured my attention, right? And this went on for years until steel trains closed in the vestibules and made it more difficult for passengers to disembark. So they would raise their windows, allowing vendors to continue hawking their wares. But then once refrigeration and air conditioning came into being, along with the harassment that Miss Miss Winston said they encountered. It just became too much, and so these are the women who would go to meet the trains, right? And in fact, whenever I would go to Orange County or Gordonsville and I'd say, hey, I'm here to talk about this, they're like, oh, you want to know about the women who met the trains. So it's an incredible story to us, but it's a repeated story to many of those whose families are involved in this down in Orange County. But here's the thing, this is one of the only official enterprises documented that we have. So much so that Gordonsville was known as the fried chicken capital of the world. Okay, that's a stretch, obviously. But they say early passenger trains didn't enjoy the luxury of dining cars and were greeted by the waiter carriers, who later became known as chicken vendors. And again, they balanced all these platters on their head. And so this particular piece, which is a plaque that's erected at the Civil War Hospital, is dedicated to these women for their contributions in Gordonsville to Gordonsville's economic, oral history, right? And they list all the women. And you know, it's incredible because if you go to the census, you can trace how and what these women often did with their proceeds. Many of them are head of household. Many of them have purchased homes and so forth. One woman, actually, Miss Hattie, started Miss Hattie's Inn. And earlier today in Professor Judson's class, we were talking about the moral economy. That is looking at this conversation through the lens of morality, right? And so one of the pieces we find out from these women is, and particularly Miss Hattie, who opened up her restaurant, is any food she had left over, what does she do with it on a daily basis? Take a guess. Who does she feed? She fed the children, she fed those who were hungry in her community, right? Which was part of uplift, and it was part of mutual aid, it was part of community investment, and it extends to today when we think about Kukachagalia under the Kwanzaa principles of collective work and responsibility. I think that's the right principle. But Miss Hattie Edwards operated her own restaurant, Hattie's Inn, both for herself, but also for her community to feed those who would have been hungry. So this is all an important story, particularly these women from Gordonsville. Another part, and I'm closing, of this story that is very interesting is the street cry. Okay, writing for the WPA, which employed millions of people to carry out public projects during the 1930s, during the New Deal era, Terry Roth talks about the rich cultural legacy left behind by these early entrepreneurs, the syncopated rhythms of the street cry. And they were more than an amusing jingle, as Roth describes them. These market songs were a central part of the hawking process. So similar to what you were contributing to us with the Kaile, okay? These folks had their own marketing call. They were created and performed extemporaneously to draw attention to their goods when trade lagged, and the songs of the food peddlers were also used to extol the virtues of their edibles. How many of you all remember the street hawker coming by your house? Anyone? Come on now, jump right out there. Just throw your hand up there. It's okay, don't be ashamed. Okay, well, I do. I'm from rural Virginia, and they would come through with fish. They would come through with fruit, so forth and so on. So let's see if I can remember how to do this. Okay, all right. So this is the fish vendor cry.
There's an old gentleman, when I was a little boy in Sumter, South Carolina, used to go around the streets selling fish. And this was the song that he would sing in the morning as he came down Manning Avenue, where I lived, and other streets throughout the city could be heard for quite a distance, for several blocks, saying, I got fresh fish this morning, ladies. They're gilded with gold, and you may find a dime in their mouths. They're just from the river St. John, St. John. I have mullets, they're fresh. and fine. Go buy these mullets all for a dime. They're just from the river St. John, St. John.
Okay. So again, these types of cries that you would hear are more than just, again, ditties of hilarity. These songs were sometimes filled with religious verbiage and with language often intended to evoke sympathy from whites. And this was about to keep going, right? As he walked through and said, hey, I'm here with my fish. Wilma Dunaway explains how African-American illegal street and door-to-door vendors would use tones of distress and lamentation to reassure their white customers of their religious decency to garner their sympathy. So that was a marketing strategy, right? Which is one of the things that we saw from the UK, UK symposium that was really important to engage in the selling of these wares. Of an enslaved woman in the 1850s in Staunton, Virginia, who advertised her garden produce by singing, Dunaway writes, and I'm quoting, I live for miles out of town, 4 miles out of town. My strawberries are sweet and sound. I'm going to glory. I fotched them 4 miles on my head. My child is sick and husband dead. I'm going to glory. Now's the time to get them cheap. Eat them with your bread and meat. I'm going to glory. Okay, end of quote. So she's talking about dying. So I'm dying, so you need to buy my produce. But this, again, there was a strategy here. And writing in this context or a related context, Thelma Foote says, the short refrains of solicitation and the theme of consumption in the street cry of the urban slave vendor reflected the process of commodification taking place at the urban market. A peach was worth 10 pence on the city streets, the slave vendor cried, because it tastes magically satisfying and it would fulfill your appetite for fresh things. Although the street cry did not explicitly reference rural sites of agricultural production, for example, the nearby truck farms in the surrounding countryside or the distant sugar plantations in the West Indies where laborers were exploited and cultivated crops destined for consumption, they did in fact, for those passersby whose ears and eyes were open to it, call attention to exploitive labor practices in colonial towns where enslaved street vendors in tattered clothing and bare feet sold agricultural produce for their masters at inflated prices. Why would they inflate the price? So they had a profit after they gave a share to their slave owner. They kept some for themselves so that they could help to buy their freedom or that of another family member, or perhaps give money for a community member in need. So again, these were very specific practices that is important for us to be aware of. Similar street cries can be heard in Baltimore, Maryland, and other places. Baltimore specifically, among the Arabers, who used to be very ever present. They even had their own historical society, though I think for the most part it's now defunct because the Arabers have died out. But this is a more contemporary picture from 1997, and they would sing red rind, tomatoes, peaches, outside with cantaloupe, yes, sweet potatoes and apples, sugar corn, red rind, tomatoes, right? So again, they would call attention to their wonderful foodstuffs. So in all, the African-American street cry was an important part of the hawking performance as the process of street selling itself. So what I've tried to do here this evening is highlight the thrifty entrepreneurial activities of African-American women and men who sold food by engaging in the underground economy. And this continues today, right? For years, I would go with my then husband, we would go to the Ghanaian woman who he ended up calling the wache lady. Wache is basically rice and beans in a red sauce, and we get fried fish or what have you. And he said for us, it's a street food, it's everyday food, it's like going to McDonald's. but it was a very hearty meal. And he would come back out, and there would be these huge, containers that we could eat off of for days. So this working the underground economy was not only historical, but it exists again today amongst all communities of people, especially given the price of licensing and so forth and so on. So whether street or pushcart vendors, hawkers or Arabbers, the marketplace landscape was very complicated. It was a place where nation, gender, race, and capitalism collided. And Robert Olwell, who's a historian, captures this point when he says, and I'm quoting, as slaveholders, and he's specifically talking about the Carolinas, Carolina whites felt that slaves should be generally subordinate, but as property holders and capitalists, they also had to recognize the legitimacy of the market in which sellers had the right to seek the highest price for their goods. So these plantation owners wouldn't necessarily come down on these women, right? They would participate. In fact, it's well documented that Thomas Jefferson and also George Washington bought goods from their enslaved. Both in slavery and beyond, many whites viewed blacks with great prejudice. Let's quote, when they sought to engage in the mode of capitalism. Under slavery's oppression, blacks, regardless of their status, enslaved or free, were to be subordinate at all times, but the marketplace allowed them to subvert this and to assert black humanity around food. So I end with this picture, which is one of my absolute favorites, so rich, there's so much here. But you've got this woman who is only known in where I started. We know her as Aunt Letty. I don't know if that's her name or not. I don't think the photographer knew. I couldn't find any information on her, even though I've searched high and low. But she's in New Bern, North Carolina. She's dressed in clothing of an earlier period and of poor rural people. And she earned her living by selling vegetables door to door. This basket of greens, for example, on her head. So we're going to listen to one more street cry, which my daughter is like, oh, that's so creepy. But we're going to listen to it anyhow, because I think it's actually a very beautiful street cry. Okay.
A man, when I was a child in Savannah, Georgia, used to sell watermelons, and he would come through every morning early, and we could hear him saying, fly round, young ladies, fly round. Can't fly myself, fly round. Watermelon so sweet, don't need no meat. These Frogtown people ain't got no teeth. Fly round, young ladies, fly round. Can't fly myself, fly round.
Okay, and then it continues from there. And this is, again, some of the power of oral history. She's recalling growing up, having heard this street cry, and then has held on to it for this time. So despite enslavement and the many difficulties African Americans have experienced since then, America is left with the food traditions of huckstering, hawking, peddling, and street crying that not only provided access to labor, but also culturally expressive forms that elevated lives of drudgery into performances with dignity. Thank you.
All right, the question and answer microphone is on. Somebody want to come up and ask a question? Yeah, come on up. Oh, you were just waving?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, come on up.
First, thank you for the presentation and for your books.
Thank you.
I'm curious, particularly in the older context you were talking about with the pepper pots, were these foods that the white customers would have been familiar with in their own cuisine context, or was this an intersection point between black cultural practices for food coming in now to the white community?
Good. From what I can find, this would have been an intersecting point. You know, the wafting smells, you know, who doesn't like the smell of good food, right? Perhaps curiosity. Because again, you're talking about Philadelphia, even though they would have had many who have come up from the South and elsewhere. Still, okra may have been new to a lot of those who were favoring the pepper pot stew. But along with the beef and the hot pepper, which I understand it was often sold during winter months. So now you're out here in the cold because it was great for colds, right? Because that hot pepper would run it out. So from everything I can find about the pepper pot stew or soup, it was very much an intersecting point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk, which was really wonderful. And I just wanted to say that I found it, and maybe other people can relate to this too, but I found it really powerfully moving to hear the sounds, those melodies, even if it wasn't the person who had originally sung it, but to hear that come to life was really very touching.
Thank you.
Yeah, and one of the photographs you showed on the screen of the train and the vendors there, as soon as I saw it, I had, you know, this very strong recollection of having taken the train, between Dakar in Senegal to Bamako in Mali. And we stopped in the middle along the way. There was nothing there but just open.
Yeah.
But, you know, the women came up and they were selling things. And I think the stop was so that we could have things from the vendors, you know. So interesting to think about those parallels. But they were also selling crafted items. And I wondered whether that was ever came up in your research.
Right, that's a good point. And you would also find this in India, parts of India as well, right? I have not found references to crafts or any of the other goods. But again, because this extended over 3 generations, I can imagine that at some point there was more being sold than food. Again, you know, there's also information. They're talking to these customers as they are selling. They're not just, you know, in silence, right? So there's a full negotiation that is taking place. But also, Ms. Winston mentions, there was a source that I have that said sometimes these women were stiffed. They didn't get paid, right? They were harassed. Inspectors would come up to them and want to know their recipe. And they were certainly harassed by the tavern owners, again, who they were in direct competition with. So while this, we celebrate this, there are some elements of it that are quite problematic and treacherous for these women who were trying to make a living, you know, at a time when opportunities beyond domestic work probably were very few. Thank you.
That last part really ties into my question,
Okay.
Which is, this was a really interesting insight into Black entrepreneurial traditions. You talked about how some of these women then made or bought their own house, were able to create wealth. In the, you know, things are regulated in a way that inhibits that Black entrepreneurial tradition.
Sure.
Maybe makes upward mobility more difficult and challenging now. In just the way you said, that think that we rule out the competition of Black people
Right.
by putting things in place that inhibits their participation. I wonder
Right.
if you just speak to that in that historical context.
Sure. In addition to the legal statutes that I cited earlier from the 1600s, 1700s, the 1800s was no different, as well as the early 1900s, right? So you're talking about 4 centuries of this sort of repression that is fostered through legal statutes and politics around keeping African American folks subjugated, right? So this is part of my frustration with social media. We boil everything down to a soundbite. But when you talk about systemic racism, you're talking about the fact that maybe 40 women over time, and maybe more, were able to build lives out of industry and thrift and entrepreneurship, which is what this country is, you know, very much founded on. But then when you go to buy a house, you know, you're told, oh, you need twice as much, or you can't live here, or you can't live there. And none of these women by any means were talking about, you mentioned wealth. Wealth in African American communities, especially at this time, was measured very differently, right? We're not owning rubber, we don't own trees, we own the house that burned down, that I used the proceeds from my chicken to rebuild. That's a very sobering, thought when we think about how much it means to the individual versus how much it may mean to the larger economy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. So I had a follow-up question about Ms. Hattie's restaurant. Who had access to this restaurant? Was it primarily for the white patrons from the area? Or did Blacks have the opportunity to, participate beyond just like getting the food, the leftover food afterwards?
Right, good. Thank you for that question. So there is no direct information to answer that question. So I'm going to go out again, and this is also for the students who I was talking to earlier today. If you think about post-enslavement, the turn of the 20th century, which was considered the nadir of Black life, right? That was the worst area of Black life because what was one of the primary codes that was introduced in addition to the Black code? Right after that, you had, come on, jump right out there. Come on, y'all, this call and response. Jim Crow, right? But before the advent of Jim Crow, Black businesses thrived because they patronized, or they had a variety of patrons, right? They had white, Black, anyone else, maybe Native people. Once Jim Crow came into being, they now, had their Black community were their primary patrons. However, in a lot of small communities, where hamlets, if you call them, you may still have had the intermixing of community. So Miss Hattie's Inn doesn't say that that she was restricting her clientele. It just says Miss Hattie's Inn was open. And because of the movement throughout the community and the fact that these women were seen as brilliant, if you will, with frying chicken, they probably did have some, white patrons. But at the same time, they were in competition with the taverns, right? Now, how many of you all are familiar with Edna Lewis? Okay, a few. Who's a grande dame in Black culinary culture and American culture. Miss Lewis was from Freetown. Freetown and Gordonsville are within the same county of Orange County. I haven't yet determined exactly what the proximity was, but I would venture to guess they all maybe knew each other. And so, a lot of these recipes that these women use may have been borrowed from one another, right? Along with, because they may or may not have been able to sustain themselves, along with the work they did in white homes, where they would also get recipes. So there was a lot of exchanging of information, of foodstuffs, or at least of food ideas. But there's no indication at all that Miss Hattie restricted the patronage. I would imagine, as an entrepreneur, she knew that was not a good business strategy, unless her life was in danger. Yeah. Okay, maybe one more.
I'm curious about the poultry production and the feed for the chickens as well, and just kind of the agricultural practices with where they were able to acquire the poultry.
Awesome question, which we don't know the answer to, right? I was in conversation with a colleague and friend, Dr. Lenny Sorensen, who was the African-American historian at Monticello for many years. And she gave me a mouthful and asked those same questions. Where did they get the feed? Whose chickens were they? Were they raising their own chickens, Because again, a lot of this for the pies and whatnot, not only did you need flour, you needed lard, eggs. Where did they get this from? Was it within their own community, or was it also the purchase from white citizens, right? There's so many unanswered questions, and unfortunately, right after I did my initial research, the last remaining descendant of one of the waiter carriers passed away before I recognized that he was alive. And so we have lost an incredible archive. So what do? How do you recreate that? Well, now you have to come at it a different way. You may have to do it through archaeological research. who had farms within proximity of where their houses are noted on the census, right? You can create a story, right? Because that's most of what we do with history. We create a story, not recreating. We're not making up stuff, but what you do is thorough research to get at what might have been the closest farm, right, which would have sold feed. What were the chickens eating? Was it the same thing they're eating today? So many questions that, given the right time and energy, someone can do a huge deep dive because they have given us an incredible start down in Orange County with this extant data. Thank you all so much. I appreciate your questions.
So again, if you'll hang tight for just a minute until Dr. Williams-Forson can get situated at the malaprops table, and then you are welcome to come see her there. Thank you for coming very
Okay,
much.
thank
I
you
hope you
very
have a
much.
nice evening.